The New Orleans Saints defense bounces back and Chase Young shines again. We got all of that and a little bit of lanyard for you on today's episode of Locked On Saints.
You are Locked On Saints, your daily New Orleans Saints podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is good, Who Dat Nation and Who Dat family? I am your host, your friend Ross Jackson, New Orleans native, your New Orleans Saints expert and credentialed member of the media covering those New Orleans Saints, is a senior writer and reporter over at Saints News Network on SI. And on today's episode of Locked On Saints, we're recapping day 6 of New Orleans Saints training camp, the second day of padded practices here in Irvine, California. Thank you very much if you're joining us live or whether you're catching us later. We appreciate you very much for being here for another episode of Locked On Saints. We're going to take a look at a few different things today. Another day, another injury for the New Orleans Saints here in training camp. We'll give you an update on what happened with Chris Olave, and I'll give you an idea of what that could potentially mean. We'll also take a look at some other attendance notes from the day as well. We're also going to take a look at some pass rushers that stood out. We're going to lead it all off with our big kickoff, which is Chase Young, who again dominated when out on the field. We appreciate you very much, as always, for making us your first listen and for being an everydayer here on the Locked On Saints podcast, which is a proud part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. In today's episode of Locked On Saints, brought to you by our friends at FanDuel, where you can make every moment more, because all summer long, FanDuel is giving out free boosts and bonuses to all customers. So that means that there is something for everyone every day, all summer long, over at FanDuel. Just head over to FanDuel.com today to get started. So it was again another day where Chase Young saw the field. Yesterday, he ended up seeing his first action, which was just 3 snaps. Today, I think it's fair to say he took the majority of first-team snaps over on the New Orleans Saints defense, and he looked every bit the part that you're hoping for as somebody that could come in and help to rejuvenate and help this New Orleans Saints pass rush and defensive line, which fell short of 40 sacks last year for the first time since 2017. When we look at where it is that he was able to come in and have this impact, it was from all phases of the game. And I think that they can all show you some translatable pieces about how it is that Chase Young can contribute to this defense once live action becomes a part of the equation. Let's start off taking a look at a sack that he had on a bootleg. Now, this wasn't just him doing things on his own. This had a lot to do with sort of the partnership between coverage and pass rush as well. And so the coverage on the back end looked really good, and that allowed for him to be able to have the time to not necessarily have to beat an offensive lineman, but simply work and work and work until he was free, and then close in on Derek Carr, who was the bootlegging quarterback at that point. He was going head-to-head with rookie offensive lineman Taliesin Fuanga on this rep, but it by no means was a lost rep by Taliesin. It was more so just Chase Young having the time to continue to work. And this is where things could be a little bit different for Chase here in New Orleans than maybe the way that things were in Washington, and even to an extent the way that things were over in San Francisco, where the secondaries were a little bit weaker than what the New Orleans Saints typically field, or at least have in the last more than handful of years, to where now maybe Chase Young really gets the opportunity to more consistently be able to take advantage of those coverage sacks that we hear about so much, where the back end has everything taken away in terms of routes being run. The quarterback has nowhere to go. He's forced to hold on to the ball longer than he wants to. Bang, a guy like Chase Young able to come in and help make the play. So that was a big one. I think the other thing that ends up telling you too is that if Chase Young is able to kind of sniff those out and has the athleticism to be able to close in on the backside of the play, because this bootleg was working across to the opposite side of where Chase Young was lined up, it could spell something in terms of or at least hint to something in terms of the value that he could bring when it comes to the mobile quarterback problem the New Orleans Saints have had in the past. On another play, he ended up blowing up an end around that was going to Chris Olave. So Chris Olave was lined up on the right side of the offense. Derek Carr took the snap. Chris Olave came around the quarterback towards the backfield. Derek Carr pitched the ball to him, and no sooner Chris Olave turned the corner, Chase Young was standing there, just a big brick wall of 99 right there in Chris Olave's face that ended up holding up what Chris Olave and the New Orleans Saints offense were trying to accomplish in that moment. And so everything, when it comes down to him being able to contribute not only in the pass rush, but also in run defense, you can see the instincts of what it is that he's able to bring to the game. And some of that's experience, some of that is natural talent, whatever it is that you want to look for there. The other one that I liked was, in another area of the game, a lot of question marks have come up about Chase Young and his effort, right? That's one of the big criticisms that you've heard about him throughout his career, taking snaps off and things like that. Well, in this situation today, there was a moment where Alvin Kamara was throwing a pass over the middle. When he was throwing that pass over the middle, Chase was all the way in the backfield, almost putting pressure on the quarterback. Or I wouldn't say so far as to he was putting pressure on the quarterback. He forced the quarterback to move to his right, dump the ball off to Alvin Kamara. And in the process of doing so, Chase Young was able to turn upfield from the backfield and end up effectively making what would have been the tackle coming up behind Alvin Kamara, who is still working upfield with the ball. So it goes to show you a little bit of the hustle, I think, that you would look for from one of these guys in terms of supreme athleticism and everything, and maybe answers one of those question marks that you might find from previous stops about his effort. That to me was a big time effort play. That to me was a big time hustle play that I think immediately references one of those concerns, or one of the old concerns that you might have heard about Chase Young. I think that the effort thing, when it comes to Chase Young, is going to diminish here in New Orleans. You've got Cam Jordan around to keep you honest. You've got Carl Granderson, who has worked so hard to go from undrafted free agent to the team's best pass rusher, now on a long-term deal, all of that. So much accountability over on the defensive side of the football. Typically, when we talked about accountability concerns over on that New Orleans Saints team, it's typically been in reference to the offensive side, fumbles, things like that, going back to some of Alvin Kamara's old comments and all. I don't think you're going to run into that here with Chase Young. Or if you do, I think it'll quickly be nipped in the bud, because what we're seeing here in New Orleans is a guy that is a sponge, soaking up coaching from his coaches, soaking up advice and tips from his teammates. Cam Jordan and him kind of walking through pass rush moves again today. Got another opportunity to see that up close and personal. So with a team that is so in need of its pass rush to be able to better impact the opposing quarterbacks, adding a guy like Chase Young and giving him a role where he can excel is something that will keep him engaged. And again, having that coverage on the back end to help produce some of those coverage pressures, coverage sacks, having the ability to rotate him on and off the field with Cam Jordan, with Carl Granderson, allows you to keep him fresh too, to where there's no tired snaps that he has to play out there, so on and so forth. So it just feels like everything kind of plays to the advantage of really being able to maximize Chase Young as long as he's healthy. And what we're seeing so far here through just his first two appearances first 2 days of appearances in practices, team drills, and things like that, is that he has everything that he needs available to him, injury-wise, health-wise, all that, to be able to be the disruptive player that the New Orleans Saints are hoping that he will be, and to be the disruptive player that the New Orleans Saints are absolutely in need of as well. So definitely something to continue to watch here as we continue on throughout this week here in Irvine, covering the New Orleans Saints here in training camp. They will have another padded practice on Wednesday, and then the day off on Thursday. So we really get an opportunity to continue to watch how things develop in the trenches over the course of the next few days. So coming up next, I want to expand this beyond just Chase Young, because he wasn't the only pass rusher or defender that stood out. In fact, some of the young pass rushers that the New Orleans Saints need a good performance from in 2024 stood out as well. We'll get to that as we continue on with today's episode of Locked On Saints, part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode of Locked On Saints is brought to you by our friends at FanDuel. So whether you are into the MLB, into the WNBA, the Olympics, there is something for you everywhere, every day on FanDuel, where it allows you to get in on the action and make watching sports a little bit more fun, right? Embrace the sweat, as they say. So when it comes down to FanDuel, there's a lot of great things that you can check out. You could even go ahead and start looking at early stuff for the NFL futures. You could bet on the New Orleans Saints right now, who are 7.5 Their win total is 7.5. You can bet the over or the under on that. And you can check out so much more as well, because right now, FanDuel is hooking up all customers with a free boost or bonus every day. Yes, so that means that there is something new every day for everyone all summer long over at FanDuel. So head over to FanDuel.com to get started. Start to make the most of your summer today. That's FanDuel, the official sports betting partner of Major League Baseball. All right, family, continuing on with today's episode of Locked On Saints, taking a look at the rest of the pass rushers that stood out for New Orleans, because it wasn't just Chase Young. They got some contributions from all along the defensive line today, whether it was on the interior, on the edge, but it doesn't mean that you need to be concerned about their offensive line just yet. Dennis Allen giving a pretty good explanation for why we're seeing what we're seeing, but still able to celebrate this defensive line a little bit. So let's take a look at all of this here. We appreciate you very much for making us your first listen of the day every day. Don't forget to go and check out the Locked On Sports Today 24/7 stream, which gets you everything going on around the world of sports. And of course, within these NFL training camps, all the big news going on. If you want the local experts angle on those, make sure you go and check out that 24/7 stream over on the Locked On Sports Today YouTube page or on the free Amazon Fire TV channels app as well. So it wasn't just Chase Young. I have a couple of other pass rushers that stood out here on this Tuesday practice, which again was the 6th practice of training camp. It was the 2nd padded practice. The Saints are going to have one more on Wednesday, take the day off on Thursday, and then 2 more padded practices after that, going into Friday and Saturday. So here's another guy that stood out to me, Payton Turner. Payton Turner stood out to me both in the pass rush and in the run game. He did get into a little bit of a scuffle today. From what I could tell, it looked like it was with Dallin Holker, but I'm not too worried about that. The competition is big. The competition is busy. There's nothing wrong in terms of all that. As long as it all gets taken care of quickly and goes away, nobody ends up getting removed from practice, anything like that. So I'm all about seeing competition being driven here for the New Orleans Saints. Payton Turner ended up having a sack on one of the team's dime reps. They started to introduce their 6 defensive back packages over on the defensive side today. I also have a rep where he flushed Spencer Rattler out of the pocket, and then DeMarco Jackson, who also had a good day, we'll get to him in just a moment, peeled away from his coverage to come down and make what would have been a sack well before Rattler had any opportunity to be able to react to it. So really, really good stuff there. Payton Turner also clogging some holes up in the middle and things like that as well when it came to the run game. So really, really good stuff for Turner, who they would love to see a lot of positives from when it comes to him being able to help to contribute to this pass rush, him being able to bolster a little bit here. I think that that's what this team really needs, is sort of that rising tide raises all ships. If you can raise the floor of your pass rush production, it gives you a lot more consistent play on a week in, week out basis when you're not having to rely on the ceiling of your best players or your top players, right, that see the most snaps. If the guys that aren't getting a ton of snaps are still out there and giving you consistent play when they are, that ends up making everything a lot better for you. Speaking of the guys that do get the most snaps, playing a ton and doing well, I'm looking at Carl Granderson today. He had another really, really good day. Couple of plays getting into the backfield, couple of run stops as well. So he had some nice moments. And he's really the guy that you're looking at to kind of help lead the charge when it comes to the defensive line, particularly from the edge rush perspective. I know Cam Jordan is your veteran leader, but you've got a guy in Carl Granderson who's coming off a season where he was your team's highest sack getter, 8.5 sacks last year. He's endeavoring to get to double-digit sacks this year. Talked a lot about sort of that mid-season slump that he hit in 2023 and all the things that he's doing right now in 2024 to make sure that that doesn't repeat itself going into this year. So if they're able to figure that part out, and if he's able to figure that part out and have that sort of consistent season, I think you're looking at him to be the guy that effectively leads the charge as your potential and probable sack leader in 2024. Let's jump ahead to Isaiah Foskey here. He had some good pressures today. And look, he had one to where he took advantage of some solid coverage, much like one of those Chase Young snaps we were talking about, to where it was the perfect marriage of coverage and pass rush and all that. But Isaiah Foskey is a guy that's continued to show up at least making a couple plays a day each day here at New Orleans Saints training camp. So he's another one, much like Payton Turner. It's where if he's able to come in and get some share of the snaps and consistently have a positive impact, it raises up the floor of what your pass rush productivity looks like as the New Orleans Saints. So I think that is a really, really good sign so far. Now, I do want to say that when it comes to why the defense had such a good day today, Dennis Allen gave us a really good piece of perspective. And it was thanks to a question from our colleague, Doug Mouton over at WWL, who asked a little bit about, are you concerned about like what's going on, or not are you concerned, but like, does the defense have an advantage right now? And Dennis Allen explained, yes, because they've only installed so much of their offense. And so now the defense is able to better anticipate what the offense is doing because the offense is working on a limited playbook right now. And so over the course of the past couple of days, we've watched the offense really take it to the defense. Now we're seeing the defense kind of combat that. And a lot of that has to do with the fact they've only installed so much. The defense has gotten into the rhythm of seeing what it is that the offense is working on, what they're doing. And so then they can better anticipate based on alignment, formation, all these other things, pattern matching, whatever, to be better prepared for what it is that the offense is doing. So I think that goes to show that you don't have to be super concerned about the offense kind of falling back here on this Tuesday practice. But at the same time, those are all good qualities of a good defense, of recognizing what it is that a team does, recognizing things based off of formation and alignment and all those pieces. So there's a little bit of give and take in terms of the success and the concern that might come with that. So if there were more reps of the offensive line just getting completely blown up, which is what we saw a little bit of in yesterday's practice, on the Monday practice when Chase Young made his debut, then I'd say that there's a real reason to be concerned about where the offensive line is right now. But based on Dennis Allen's comments and based upon what we saw today, which didn't look like a lot of examples of offensive linemen just plain losing reps, sure, here and there, but there were just as many of those examples of defensive linemen losing reps too. So it doesn't feel like you have to be uber concerned about the New Orleans Saints offensive line based on this practice. And it's also worth mentioning too that, when we talk about Payton Turner and Isaiah Foskey and Carl Granderson and Chase Young, these guys are taking snaps with different teams. These aren't all first team reps where the defensive line is getting after the quarterback or making stops in the run game and things like that too. So even in those situations where it's not a limited, even if it were a situation where it's not a limited offense, some of those lower on the depth chart defensive ends that are getting pressure and things like that, they're not doing it against the starting defensive line. So it's not that the starting defensive line is giving all this stuff up. So just something to keep in mind there. Coming up next, I want to take a look at DeMarco Jackson and his day. But first, I want to look at Chris Olave. Another day, another injury for the New Orleans Saints. Here during training camp practices. Is this something that we should absolutely be concerned about? We got that coming up for you next as we continue on with today's episode of Locked On Saints, part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And today's episode of Locked On Saints is brought to you by friends at Game Time. I've been talking about Game Time all week because my good friend John Hendricks and I ended up going to an Angels game here in Southern California while we're here covering New Orleans Saints training camp. And it was an absolute blast. Because of Game Time, I was able to grab 2 tickets for $18. No sneaky fees that popped up or surprise fees that popped up at the end. We were able to look at the view from our seats before buying the tickets. We were able to make sure that we got exactly what it was that we were looking for and that we wanted. And we were able to get all of them very quickly. I mean, we bought them the day of the game, so I didn't have to plan months in advance. We literally made the decision a couple of days in advance, and I didn't have to pay an exorbitant amount in order to make it happen. So that's my experience with Game Time. And I know that is the consistent experience with Game Time. So if you haven't heard of it and you'd like to try it out, I cannot recommend it enough. And especially since you're a listener here on the Locked On Saints podcast, there's a real way for you to be able to try this out for the first time and really enjoy it. They'll help you take all the guesswork out of buying your tickets. Just download the Game Time app, create an account, and use the promo code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off of your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem that code LOCKEDON NFL for $20 off. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. Get a little sip in. All right, we appreciate you very much for being here and continuing on with us as we continue on with today's episode of Locked On Saints. And as I always say, let's get it, Who Dat Nation. So we're wrapping it up today, looking at another day, another injury for the New Orleans Saints. The Saints have not come out unscathed when it comes to a single practice so far. From the very first practice of camp, we saw the Kendre Miller injury. We saw the Justin Herron injury. We saw Marshawn Lattimore injured at one point, having to leave the field. And on Tuesday's sixth practice, it happened again. They had almost made it through an entire practice without losing a player. And unfortunately, right after the last kind of set of team reps, Chris Olave, New Orleans Saints wide receiver, ended up walking off the field, as Dennis Allen phrased it, gingerly. I would agree with that. Apparently, he had come down hard on his hip, and so that's what caused it. So maybe it's just a hip contusion or something like that, maybe a bruise, something to that effect. It didn't look like it was any kind of like concerning non-contact injury or any kind of concerning, ankle thing or anything like that. It wasn't any of that. He just came down hard on his hip. So we'll see what this means for him. Maybe he ends up taking a rest tomorrow. Not a lot of question marks that you have to answer with Chris Olave. Obviously, you want him in the offense and continuing to install the new things that the offense are doing, but he's going to be fine. I mean, he's your starting guy. It's not like you have to answer any big questions about him at all. But I think the thing that is overall, I think the thing that's overall concerning really just comes down to whether or not the Saints are going to be able to truly keep these or find a way to keep these players healthy with the track record that they've set so far here through training camp. If they can't find a way to do that, then I think that you end up risking a lot of longevity of, or really risking your ability to be successful in this game this year. If they're not able to stay healthy, they're not going to be able to compete. And so far, we've seen injuries to guys like Marshawn Lattimore, Chris Olave, Kendre Miller. We're talking about guys that are expected to contribute here in 2024. Now, how do you help your player be ready for falling on their hip hard? There's not really a way for you to be able to prep a player for that. You can't swap out his hip with a titanium hip and hope that he's going to be fine. That's just one of those things that happens. And that, thankfully, has kind of been the sort of version of injuries that the Saints have seen so far, or that has been typical of the injuries that the Saints have seen so far this training camp. They've been more impact things, not necessarily things that you feel like you could avoid in some other way. So I would put that up on top of it. But I do think that it is still concerning to see the amount and the number of injuries that we've seen so far, 6 days through, and 6 injuries at least for the New Orleans Saints, at least an injury every day throughout those 6 days. So I want to update you now on some of the other things that we've seen in terms of attendance for the New Orleans Saints. So we did not see Equanimeous St. Brown out on the field today, the New Orleans Saints wide receiver who they acquired over the course of this offseason. We have not seen the return of Marshawn Lattimore yet. We haven't seen him out on the field, near the field, anything like that yet either. So sometimes maybe guys don't make it back out on the field in order to participate or, be a part of drills and things like that, but they'll still be off to the side and watch, maybe work with a coach and things like that, or work with trainers and things like that. We haven't seen Marshawn at all when it comes to that conversation just yet. Fullback Xander Horvath hasn't been there for the past couple of days. Dennis Allen clarified that is because of personal reasons. That is not an injury-related thing. The expectation is that he will be back soon. And I believe the expectation is that he'll be back for Wednesday's practice. Nick Saldiveri, who left practice early recently, was not seen. And then Trajan Jeffcoat, who had that scary elbow injury where they actually had to come and bring the cart out for him. He has not been seen since that injury, which was early on in the first week of camp. So those are the guys that weren't in attendance today. Chris Olave was the only player to leave early. The other thing that we saw were Kendre Miller was off to the side. Brian Brzee, who wasn't at practice a few days ago, he was off to the side. And then Nephi Sewell, who is on that physically unable to perform list, still recovering from an injury from last year. all of that. He was off to the side watching and taking in practice. Sometimes you've seen some guys like him, Tano Passanio, as well as Juwan Johnson, who aren't expected to be back anytime soon, still watching and participating or running and jogging. Tano tends to run around with like a weighted vest on and everything and do some work with trainers and rehab and all that. So they're continuing their rehab process and everything. But that's an update on the attendance today. I think the biggest takeaway, though, is that you've had 6 practices and at least an injury every practice, and now you've just had your top wide receiver and your offense is arguably their top weapon limp off the field at the end of team drills, and so that could end up causing some issues for the New Orleans Saints. But we'll see. Again, the good news is that Chris Olave knows the offense; they know how to use him. He's not jostling for position; he's the bona fide number one. All he has to do is be healthy. That's really it. And so keeping him healthy should be the first priority. Again, I wouldn't be surprised either way. I wouldn't be surprised to see him tomorrow, knowing how much of a competitor he is. Thinking back to the New England game last year where he hurt his ankle before the game and then still played in that game, kind of went out there and tested it out before the game and then ended up playing. So I wouldn't be surprised to see him out there on Wednesday. Also wouldn't be surprised to either see him off to the side or not see him at all on Wednesday. Thursday's the day off. I always talk about how sometimes teams will make the sort of economical decision or the pragmatic decision of, okay, you can get 2 days of rest, but only miss one practice in this way, to where you miss that Wednesday practice, but then you already have the Thursday off. That could be a direction that they go as well. And then as for any updates on guys like Juwan Johnson and Tano Passanio and things like that, the team is not required to give updates. So really all that we can say is that we see them around and that they're continuing their rehab process. The one thing I can tell you about Juwan Johnson is, remember, he had that foot surgery. We don't see him with any like boots or straps or anything like that. Like his foot doesn't look wrapped from afar or anything like that. He's not wearing a boot, and he was jogging the other day, which is a pretty good sign for a guy that just had surgery on his foot. So I would say that visually those would be the updates there, but we don't have firm updates in terms of details on timeline and things like that. But that's kind of where things are right now when it comes to that. All right, I want to wrap up today's show by getting to my dog of the day. We've been doing this every day, talking about how the New Orleans Saints have brought a lot of energy so far during these practices. They're bringing a lot of competition in these practices. And so I want to celebrate the player that I watch that catches my eye over and over again because they're constantly competing. And for me, that player today was linebacker DeMarco Jackson. DeMarco Jackson is not a player that gets a ton of shine anytime that he's out on the field or anything like that. Doesn't get a ton of the conversation when it comes to the linebacker room, especially now because it's populated with guys like Demario Davis and Pete Werner, and then you have the exciting addition of Willie Gay. But for me, the big conversation or the big thing that stands out to me about DeMarco Jackson is that he never, ever, ever stops pushing. Never stops pushing, is always competing, all that. So I saw him on a couple of different plays. He had a couple of great run fits where he, stepped into gaps and then got made some plays in those situations. I also had him combining with Payton Turner on that sack to where he was dropped back in coverage. Payton Turner flushed the quarterback out over to his side, and that typically creates a little bit of conflict for whoever is kind of in that flats coverage over off to the side. That's where the quarterback wants to go most comfortably, the shortest and easiest route for him to target. And so if you're the defender, you're stuck in the conundrum of, do I keep this player covered and let the quarterback begin to run, or do I crash down on the quarterback and potentially leave the receiver that I'm supposed to be covering open over the top of me? And so you have to be really, really strategic, and it has to be timed perfectly when you decide to peel off of that coverage or leave that coverage in order to go and chase down that quarterback. And he did it perfectly to a T. Broke off of his coverage, came crashing downhill right at Spencer Rattler, and then everybody on the defensive side just ignited. The New Orleans Saints offense found early success in 7-on-7s where they completed a bunch of passes. I think there was only one incomplete pass during that, and the offense was cheering and shouting, talking about how the tables had turned and all these other things. And then all of a sudden, the defense just kind of said, no, buddies, we're still here, and ended up making plays. And that DeMarco Jackson play was one of the most energy injecting plays that I think that we saw all day. So really, really good stuff to see from DeMarco there, who deserves our Dog of the Day nomination. Coming up in tomorrow's episode, we're going to take a look at the Saints using play action, which they're doing a ton here throughout training camp. What role will that play in the offense? We're also going to dive into offensive line coach John Benton and how his coaching is already benefiting offensive tackle Trevor Penning. And we're going to take a look at what happens if Chris Olave misses time and what that means for the rest of the wide receivers, who they're still waiting for somebody to stand out amongst that group. We got that coming up for you in tomorrow's episode of Locked On Saints. We appreciate you very much, as always, for being here and for making us your first listen. Don't forget to go and check out Locked On Pelicans as well as Locked On LSU for more of what's going on all around Locked On Louisiana. And, of course, don't forget that we will be here with you every single day live right after New Orleans Saints training camps and a fresh episode in the morning over on the Locked On Saints podcast as well. So always something for you here over on Locked On. We appreciate you very much, as always, making us a part of your day, part of your routine, for saying yes to me and the show. As always, if you see me, please say hi. And if you need anything else around your New Orleans Saints in between these episodes, make sure you follow me on your favorite social media at Ross Jackson, NOLA. Hit me up. Let me know how the family's doing. Let me know how you're living. Let me know how you're momming them. And trust Who Dat Nation. I'll holla at you.